to see this film. Of course, I was very, I think, insisted that you give us a chance to play it. So we thank you for making this your North American premiere. We are going to have a panel where we get a chance to hear from Jean-Christophe and we get a chance to hear from the Schulbergs. Before we do, I'm going to introduce some of the members on the panel, and then we'll set them up here so we can all get a chance to hear from them and have questions for them, okay? So I just want to mention those that are here today. Michael Sales is here. Michael, it's Michael Sales. He's got a doctorate in organizational theory and intervention method from Harvard's Graduate School of Education and an economics degree from the Wharton School. For 40 years, he has provided strategic leadership development consulting services across a range of economic sectors. Michael has studied social systems at both a broad and intimate level. He has considered the relation between personality and society. The Holocaust presented humanity with a brutal shadow that threatens the survival of our species. Thank you, Michael, for participating in this panel. We also want to welcome Howard Simon. There he is. He has taught in, yes. He has taught and defended the values of American democracy for more than 50 years. He received his PhD in legal and political philosophy from the University of Minnesota, and for about a decade taught at the University of Minnesota and DePaul University. For more than 4 decades, after teaching at the college level, he directed programs to defend and advance the values of American democracy, serving as the executive director of the Michigan affiliate of the American Civil Liberties Union and the American Civil Liberties Union of Florida. Howard focused on issues that include the defense of freedom of speech, religious liberty, equal treatment, and the right to vote. Let's give it up for Howard Simon. And we could bring some chairs up here now. Yeah, while I'm talking, it's good. We also have Casey Schulberg, noted community organizer and international media specialist. Casey has served as the executive director of the Fort Myers-based clean water nonprofit Calusa Waterkeeper since July 1st of 2018, and produced and directed 2 documentaries for the organization, including Eternal Vigilance, which screened this year at the Fort Myers Film Festival. He currently is in production on the 3rd documentary for the Calusa Waterkeeper called Waterbone that will air on WGCU later this year. Schulberg has worked in multiple capacities on numerous 200 movies, miniseries, and television movies on both sides of the Atlantic. He has a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in directing from Carnegie Mellon University. Please welcome Casey Schulberg. Let's have the first 3 of you who I introduced go ahead and grab a seat now. Also, Sandra Schulberg is president. Yes. You interrupted me and said you're president. I didn't know you were president. Congratulations. Of Indie Collect, a nonprofit organization that saves, restores, and revives significant films. Besides Nuremberg, her team has recently restored The Atomic Cafe, The War at Home, It Happens to Us, Thank You, and Good Night. Her producer credits include the Oscar-nominated Quills, Exposed, and others. In 1994, the IFB honored her contributions to American independent cinema with its Spirit Award. An adjunct professor at Columbia University, she teaches feature film financing. Please welcome Sandra Schulberg. All right. Jean-Christophe Klotz is a well-known international TV journalist. His experience as a reporter in Rwanda during the Tutsi genocide inspired his documentary feature, Return to Kigali, which premiered at the Cannes Film Festival. He has directed many acclaimed documentaries including Roads to Terror, Blackout, and John Ford, the Man Who Invented America. He lives in the south of France and has traveled here to be with us. Let's give it up for Jean-Christophe Klotz. Who am I missing? Is Cesar here? No, okay. All right, so this is our panel. Let's welcome him now. I have microphones. So, without any further ado, we're going to start with Sandra.
Well, we could spend an entire day deconstructing our father's original film, which had to cram a whole year-long trial into 80 minutes, and we could spend a whole day deconstructing Jean-Christophe's film about the making of that film and how those images were chosen and how they've been repurposed, how they've been also misappropriated. But we don't have time for all this. So I thought I would just, throw out a couple of, make a few points that I think could get you thinking as the rest of this illustrious team weighs in. First of all, I want to just say that we did, for those of you who are wondering, we didn't change a frame of Stuart Schulberg's film. We did have to reconstruct the soundtrack because the original soundtrack had been lost. And in the course of doing that, we had Leah Schreiber re-record my father's original narration because in the original, because you heard the trial was conducted in 4 languages with simultaneous translation. There could never be a single language version of the original film. And back in 1948, they decided they didn't want people to have to read subtitles. So in the German version of the film, a German narrator told you what everyone was saying, including telling you what the German defendants were saying. And in the English language version, the version that was suppressed, an English-speaking narrator told you what everyone was saying, including Justice Jackson. In the English language version, you didn't hear Jackson in his own words. You didn't hear anyone speaking in his, there were no she's, in his own words. So we decided that we would, since we had to reconstruct the soundtrack anyway, that we would have Liev Schreiber re-record my father's original narration, except for those pieces of sound where the original narrators were telling you verbatim what was being said. And we went back to the original soundtrack. The whole trial was recorded for sound. And we pulled those pieces of sound from the original soundtrack and subtitled those to try to make the whole experience of being in that courtroom more present for an audience today. And that was by far the hardest thing we did. And in the course of doing that, we learned what Axel Fischer says in Jean-Christophe's film, which was that the Signal Corps cameramen really didn't know what they were shooting. They were perfectly skilled camera people, but they didn't understand the structure of the trial. They didn't understand what was important, what wasn't important. They never even recorded Jackson's famous opening and closing speeches. They only took bits of it. And so that's why when you watch my restoration, you see that what you're hearing Jackson say doesn't match the movement of his lips. And that's not because we're just incompetent filmmakers coming 60 years later. It's because they didn't record some of the most important points that he made. And anyway, that's just a little insight into the technical challenge that we faced. Now, more interestingly, I think, and this relates to the theme of this panel perhaps, is that, I think you have to understand that this film was, in a sense, a work of propaganda. We can say it's propaganda for the good guys, it's propaganda for the notion of creating a new body of international criminal law. It's propaganda for the idea of prosecuting not just crimes against war, which is actually a very ancient concept. The first case prosecuting a war crime was held back in the 1400s. But this idea that you would prosecute the very act of making war, what Jackson called the conspiracy to commit the crime of aggression, that was very new at Nuremberg. And the concept of crimes against humanity, that was also very new at Nuremberg. So you can say this is a film that is a propaganda film for these very important concepts. The Russians, as you heard, made their own film. It's almost identical to Stuart's film. It's more acerbic. It's funnier, I would say. And of course it focuses more on the Soviet losses, which were enormous, absolutely enormous. I mean, the Americans got off easy compared to the Russians. So these were competing visions of basically the same event. In my father's film, there are 2 or 3 problematic and interestingly problematic pieces of footage. One is that it's an image that's been repurposed 1,000,000 times. You see these little kids rolling up their sleeves and showing you their tattoos. And of course, you are thinking as you watch that these are children who were annihilated during the Holocaust. But no, these are the ones who survived. They didn't bother to tattoo the ones who went straight to the gas chambers. But these children stand in for, because the filmmaker is having to try to use film to convey his points. And so these children stand in for the thousands and thousands, the hundreds of thousands of children who were sent straight to the gas chambers or who were shot. There's another piece of film that is very problematic, and Jean-Christophe and I talked about whether we could address it in his fascinating film, and that is the scene where you think you're watching the actual asphyxiation of people in the gas chamber of Bergen-Belsen. You see the Mauserbad, the shower head, the fake shower head. You see a number of people naked on the floor of what is a gas chamber, what appears to be a gas chamber. You see a gloved hand turning what appears to be the turning on of the gas. All of that was reconstructed by our US and British liberators to show you what had happened. It wasn't footage shot by Germans as it was happening. And when I showed this film recently at a law school, I've shown the film hundreds of times and at many law schools. When I showed this film most recently at St. John's School of Law and told the students afterwards that scene had not been shot by the Nazis, they were aghast. They didn't take it as seriously, because once they learned that it had been shot by Americans and Brits, it sort of detracted from its validity. And that really brought home to me this whole concept of context, of the importance of the context. Do we need to know who shot this footage, when and where and for what purpose, in order to allow our brains to process it accurately? This film, my father's film, they took a lot of liberties in order to convey what they thought was an essential truth. But along the way, as all of us who are filmmakers know, you're constantly, in a way, tricking the viewer. Now, I want to make one other point or elucidate something that relates back to the theme of the panel too, which is that, as you heard, 3 men were acquitted at Nuremberg, and one of them was the head of Germany's radio system, Hans Fritzsche. And this brings us to but on the other hand, Streicher, who was the publisher of Der Stürmer, this really filthy anti-Semitic tract, he was sentenced to death by hanging, and he was executed. So why this distinction between one propagandist who used print and another propagandist who used radio? This whole question of when hate speech rises to the level of a crime was gone into at great length, not at Nuremberg, but at the Rwanda trial for the first time, which Jean-Christophe knows a great deal about because he filmed there and was shot there and made 2 films about his experiences in Rwanda. But there, the media case became very important because radio was actively used to pit one ethnic group against another and to describe them as less than human, just the way Jews were described as less than human, and Gypsies and gay men and women. And that gave people permission to kill them. So this whole idea of when does incitement to genocide, as it's called, or rise to the level of a crime, is a fundamental issue that we're still evolving. This is an evolving area of the law, and it is a fascinating and very important law because concept, because it comes up against, at least in the United States and in many other countries, the whole concept of freedom of speech. So this was resolved in two very different ways at Nuremberg. It was resolved in yet another way at the Rwanda Tribunal. And of course, it's being, in a way, you could say, litigated today in the United States. So I'll pass the mic.
Let's hear from Jean-Christophe. And by the way, those of you, after we speak, we'll the opportunity to have some questions for everyone. But Jean-Christophe.
I'll be short. It's the first time I see both films in a row, and it's very interesting to see, because you see the same shots, and then you think, well, who is behind the camera? Who is behind the editing machine? And it gives a whole perspective, I think, and this would be very interesting to discuss, but it might take us very far. The other thing I realized watching both films, and when you were saying we're all filmmakers, is that these two films make me think, why do we film? What for? And of course, every time you take a camera and you film, it is fake. All the time, because you have to choose your shots, you have to choose the way you edit, and it is fake, it's a reconstruction. Maybe the important question is the truth of what you're trying to say. And to understand the whole process, that what you're seeing it's just images. So how can an image be a proof? An image by itself can never be a proof, because it's just a testimony of a specific time, specific day, specific angle. And there's so much to teach to people, to kids, to adults, about how we produce the images. And it's so interesting to see that it's Hollywood made. I mean, my son here asked me, well, you know what, in your father's film, when they announced the sentences, and suddenly you see the crimes, and you hear about it's a movie. I mean, you're in Hollywood straight, and it's very different from when you are in the courtroom and you listen when you see the. So many questions to be addressed. But as you said, propaganda, yeah. But for what we truly believe as the right side of things, but propaganda, sure. So why do we make films? It's an enormous question. Next in row.
Yeah, so if you'll permit me, my job on this panel is to pivot from then to now. Our dad's movie was called Nuremberg, It's Lesson for Today. So is there a lesson for today? The point of the movie back then was to denazify the German people. It was to show the German people the atrocities that their leaders had committed, because everybody in Germany was brainwashed into thinking they had great leaders and that their country was doing wonderful things. So after the war, it was very difficult to de-indoctrinate them. So what are we doing today? What kind of risks are we subject to in terms of indoctrination or conspiracy theories or false narratives that are being put out there for various reasons? And I don't want to get too on the nose about this, but in America, we have a dual problem. We've got people who are ideologically motivated to create a false narrative, and we've got a financial incentive to create that false narrative. I want to quote a few statistics. 3, 30,000, 3 million, 100 million, 410%, and 40%. So what do those statistics mean? Well, 3 people, the man who went into the pizza parlor convinced that there was a pedophile ring in the basement being run by Democrats. He fired 3 shots in that pizza parlor. 30,000 is the number of people that we think, 30,000 is the number of lies that was purportedly told by the past president while he was in office. 3 million is the supposed number of QAnon believers today. 100 million was the number of views on YouTube in 2012, and the director of engineering, Christos Goodrow, vowed to get that up to 1 billion by 2016, and he actually achieved that goal. He had 1 billion viewers of YouTube on October 22nd, 2016, and they did that by using a recommendation tool, so that when a conspiracy theory was aired on YouTube, someone viewed that, and you would automatically get a recommendation for another view that was similar. And those recommendation views catapulted YouTube to the front. They overtook Facebook, which in 2012, YouTube had 100 million views, and by 2016, and Facebook had 160 million views a day. And by 2016, YouTube surpassed Facebook with this mechanism, and they had 1 billion views. They celebrated it 2 weeks before the 2016 election. 40% is Facebook. The arch-right conspiracy theories provide much more engagement than even arch-left conspiracy theories, much more so than regular Facebook engagement. So basically, Facebook is monetizing engagement. So when the arch-right conspiracy theories get 40% more engagement, that provides a lot of advertising dollars for YouTube, and it allows them to gain a lot of money. So people who were actually anti-conspiracy theories were finding ads for conspiracy theories on their anti-conspiracy theory websites. This was a weird conundrum, and it was basically because Facebook had created an algorithm to drive that media. So we've got a problem, and we've got to figure out how to roll some of this back. And then the 400 is the number of people who are presently charged with insurrection at the US Capitol. So I'm just saying this discussion of propaganda that we were trying to figure out in 1948 has not ended, and we're still in the middle of this issue and trying to find our way toward a little more understanding of it. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic to Howard Simon, and we'll see if we want to weigh in on the historical or the present. It's up to Howard. He's brilliant.
Well, thank you. I'm going to weigh in on both the historical and the current. Thanks, Casey. I just want to say what an honor it is to be on this panel with Sandra and Jean-Christophe. I mean, you got to step back and take a big historical look at the significance of what they've done. Let me start with Sandra for a second. Preserving this film and showing this film all over the country is just such a monumental contribution. This is a film about some of the most horrific brutality that human beings have inflicted on other human beings. But this is our history. This is some of the most significant events in Western civilization. And preserving this film and showing this film, I think ensures that, first of all, number one, these events will not be forgotten, and number two, that future generations will have an opportunity to learn about it. So this is just a magnificent historical contribution that you've done. Just congratulations. I want to step back and look at the legal system and really take a big picture of the legal system. So, I can't believe that we're so far into 2 films and a panel, and nobody has ever mentioned the other film, Judgment at Nuremberg. Great film, but you could see but not history. Really good film, but it's not history. Justice Jackson was brilliant in thinking that the way this trial is going to have to take place, it's going to have to take place not with witnesses and cross-examination that you may be familiar with in other trials and that you saw in Judgment at Nuremberg. We had to convict the Nazis based on their own words and their own video. And then, not video made by the US, video that they did. And so think about the historical contribution that your father and your uncle made by accomplishing that, because I'm not sure the Nuremberg trials would have been so successful as they were without that. And then you can draw a direct line from the Nuremberg trials to this effort to create an international court of criminal justice that holds leaders accountable, and that did hold leaders accountable only recently in, think of Slobodan Milosevic and the other leaders in the wars in Yugoslavia, in which there were essentially crimes against humanity that they were convicted of. Some of them died in prison, some are still serving time in prison in Great Britain. And then think of the trials that took place for the genocide in Rwanda and Darfur and so on. You can draw a straight line from Nuremberg to the trials that took place in The Hague for the Bosnian Serb brutal efforts against largely the Muslims in Srebrenica and Sarajevo, and then Darfur, and so that this is another, I think, magnificent achievement. Let me make a last point and then try to transition to what's happening now, because I think the other lesson that I take away from all of this is that the film that your father and your uncle did is a film that reminds us, that should remind us, that democracies die at the hands of authoritarians, and that it's naive to think that it can't happen here. It can happen here, and we need to learn that lesson. Not only think of Germany in 1933 to 1945, but how it is happening right now in places like Hungary and Poland and Venezuela and Turkey and places like that, places where democracy is dying at the hands of authoritarians. And we know how this has worked. Some populist demagogue exploits concerns on the part of the public, wins political power through some legitimate means, uses disinformation to shape public policy, and then usurps constitutional power to cement their rule. This is what Putin has done in Russia, what Chavez did in Venezuela, what Orban is doing in Hungary, what Erdogan is doing in Turkey, and what Hitler did in Germany in 1933. So that's the lesson that I take away from all of this, that we have an obligation to resist that, and to resist that by working to strengthen the institutions of democracy that we have in this country. For example, our system of free elections, our independent press that is a watchdog of government, the danger of the former president calling the media the enemy of the people, which is a phrase from Joseph Stalin and so on. these are dangerous times that we live in, and what I take away from this film is our obligation to, as I said, protect the institutions of democracy so that we don't lose it here to authoritarian rule.
Thank you so much, Sandra and Jean-Christophe, for these wonderful, wonderful movies. So I take these films personally. I suffer from what I call the Holocaust hangover. Knowing that there are thousands of people who actually delighted and would delight again in the killing of Jews, makes me paranoid. It's given me, contributes to anxiety in my life. It's unfortunate. You know, and I think that as Jean-Christophe's film about Rwanda and our references to Rwanda have shown, that while what happened in the Shoah was very tragic, and the village that my grandfather immigrated from, called it was a shtetl, that my grandfather immigrated from in 1900, that village was liquidated. So that, you know, it's a horrible, horrible thing. 1,400 people got killed. But it's happening all the time. And it's happened, you know, these hostilities between demographic groups and between majoritarian groups and minorities, it's happened throughout human history. And it's happening right now, as Howard has referred to. And I mean, the list of genocidal activity that's going on is enormous. And I think that the nature of extreme nationalism, you know, name your country or name your nation state first, whatever, you know, France first, Russia first, China first, you know, America first, right? That kind of thinking, it thrives on the persecution of scapegoats, on the discovery of scapegoats. It needs scapegoats. And the Jewish people, I could say quite a bit about the nature of the Jewish people and their movement after the collapse of biblical Israel to migrate as a dispersed and relatively small community throughout Europe and Africa, North Africa, and the fact that the Jews, like any immigrant group, did the work that the majoritarian groups did not want to do, or were prevented from doing, such as engaging in banking, such as being tax collectors, that this made the Jews vulnerable to hostile reactions by majorities. And there's a bunch more I could say about the nature of the Jewish people and their experience, and also the nature of Judaism. And the fact that Judaism demands literacy combined with the internationalism of the Jewish people meant that Jews were exposed to lots and lots of ideas which they understood. They interacted with lots and lots of different kinds of thinkers, and this made them very threatening to the Nazis and the object of hatred of book burners with very narrow-minded points of view. And I could say other things about what Judaism is and how that makes it a frequent target and victim of scapegoating and attacks. But I'll just close with this, that this type of film, right, that the Shoah will come anywhere and any time that the conjoined plagues of ignorance and fear are not confronted with hard facts, truth, rich discussion, and strong policies that would encounter the excesses of extreme nationalism. And this film, Nuremberg, is a lesson for today, is that we need to have a disindoctrination in the United States, in particular after the assault on truth that we have been through for the last 5 years.
Questions from the audience?
Yes,
Or did you want to introduce
yeah.
the other?
We're going to do, just so you know, we're so thankful to have this panel here, and we have maybe about 10 minutes for questions from the audience for you, and then we're going to start our awards ceremony and celebration on the rooftop while we'll be enjoying the conclusion of the Fort Myers Film Festival. We do have a little fun here too. So having said that, any questions from the audience? Let's go, just raise your hand if you have a question for any of these, our esteemed panel here today. Yes, please, right here, please speak up.
I thought both films were excellent. I'm intrigued what reason was given to Stewart that this film, maybe you could elaborate a little more on it not being shown in the U.S. after it was made. And how did that affect him? He went on to have a wonderful career in TV and didn't seem like had a lot of failure to his life. Did he feel that it was a failure, or?
It's so interesting that you ask, and this is Margaret Jorgensen, who actually worked with Stuart Schulberg, and it's so wonderful that you were able to come this afternoon. You know, Stuart, Casey and I don't remember Stuart ever talking about this film. I did find in the course of going through all the documents that he wrote a letter in 1960 to the New York Times saying that there must have been some event in the, or perhaps it was maybe it was 61, perhaps it was the trial of, oh God, help me, Eichmann, the Eichmann trial that provoked him to write to the New York Times and say, you know, he never said, I made this film. He said that a film exists about the Nuremberg trial that unfortunately has never been seen in this country and that might perhaps be relevant. And I think this indicated to me that this was still a sore point, that he regretted it. The person who really, but Stuart went on to become head of the denazification film unit in Germany, and he spent 2 years making denazification re-education films in Germany. Then he was made head of the film program of the Marshall Plan. Then he made feature films in Europe. So he was really based in Europe for 10 years after finishing Nuremberg. And I think that, so he was perhaps much less regretful, less aware of what the lack of, the fact that the film wasn't getting out, that perhaps was not so present for him because he was doing his work in Europe, in France and Germany. The person who was devastated by the fact that the film was not being released was Père Lorenz, who had actually hired my father. He was a famous documentary filmmaker in his own right, who had made The River and The Plow That Broke the Plains. He's sometimes referred to as FDR's filmmaker because they had a close relationship. And Pear resigned from the War Department just as the loyalty oaths were starting to be circulated, because he had friends who were communists and he felt vulnerable. So my father was left to continue to make the film without Pear. But when Pear learned that the film was not going to be released, he offered to reimburse the U.S. government, the War Department, for the entire cost of the film and release it himself. And we found letters from his lawyer, repeated letters from his lawyer to the U.S. government, like pressing to have the film shown. So this was really devastating for him because he was back in the U.S. And Justice Jackson was really pissed off about the fact, because of course this is, he was really the driving force in some way behind the film, and he's sort of the star of the film. And he cared so desperately about these issues of international criminal justice and the crime of aggression. So he wanted to show the film just privately to a meeting of the New York City Bar Association, and the War Department refused him refused to loan him a print of the film to show. So in 48. So that shows you how afraid they were, I think, that this film would get out and undermine U.S. policy at the time. Anyway, it's a long and fascinating story, and there's much more to talk about.
I wanted to add very quickly, what I think was incredible, the whole story is incredible, but then that the film is not released is really a lesson for today. I mean, that was the point also of the whole film. So much effort, so much noble ideas, and then finally, well, we've moved to something else. It's an enormous lesson too.
This is alluded to in Jean-Christophe's movie, and Sandra has said this before, but the policy of the U.S. State Department by 1948-49 was, we've shifted, the new enemies are the Russians and the communists, and leave the Germans alone. They've suffered enough, and now we're trying to rebuild. And the American public can't handle two enemies at one time. So let's just focus on making the enemies the communists and let the Germans die, kind of a. So that was pretty significant reason for the movie being buried.
On that note, and I know there's going to be more questions, and you guys will be around to discuss with those in the audience who want to meet you and get a chance to talk to you. I do want to kind of leave it before the award ceremony with a question to Jean-Christophe, because this is a film festival, and I took a lot of satisfaction in your film, and especially through the eyes of these, what I saw as kind of these superhero filmmakers and the film editors, and that's what your father and uncle really were. As we saw the change in look from after the footage was played, I think speaks volumes, and it's remarkable as to what the power of film and the power of truth in film means. And I just don't know if you had a chance to just say basically why you got involved with this film and what it means to you to screen it here, and where we'll be able to see it next, maybe.
What was the last question?
And where we'll be able to see it next.
No, well, the story is briefly that our families, my family and the Schulberg's family, are very close since right after the war. Stuart hired my dad as an editor, and it was the beginning of a love story that still have. So for me, it was very moving to come here at Casey's place and to be with Sandra. So it's it's important. We're very much involved in movies. We believe in the strength of that art and awareness and all that, but the fact it's amplified by the family links there. So, no, just I knew about Sandra's work on the film, but I didn't know the details, and then I was discussing with Arte and 75th anniversary, and then I called both of them, and we said, yeah, let's try to do something about this. Well, it was never screened in France. And I work with many people in the movie industry and the TV business, and nobody heard about the film, which is incredible. And there's been so much documentary about Nuremberg, so much Hollywood films, and you know, well, you were talking about Judgment in Nuremberg, and you see exactly the same the same situation. So it was really incredible that nobody knew about that film. So that basically that's the.
Well, I'm going to say that it was a world premiere after this. I get a feeling that we could spend the entire night at the Sidney Davis Art Center having this discussion, and I will apologize that it's kind of limited here, but we do have, after an award ceremony, an opportunity to all discuss and have a little enjoyment on top of the rooftop at Sidney's. So I would like to conclude this panel for now, and if we could give a big round of applause. Thank you so much. If you guys want to take your seats, we'll move into the award ceremony. While you're doing that, I do want to say that we had so many filmmakers come in from all over the world, and they're here tonight. And I want to introduce any and all of you who are here, filmmakers who worked on